Hello, I hope that this is going out fine and you can see me, so if someone could flag and let me know, that would be fantastic. So, apologies, huge apologies for the delay in getting on here. I'm not entirely sure what's happened. I've had an issue with my computer, so I am coming to you from my mobile phone. So I'm really sorry that this is only going out on the Highland Archive Centre's page and not on the 4 pages as it would usually do. So sincere apologies, and if you know anyone who normally watches on one of the other pages, please do encourage them to come over to the Hark page and watch, as I'm not able to broadcast across all 4 at the moment. So I was so looking forward to chatting to you about Marivor, and then my morning's gone all wrong now. So as I say, apologies for being late starting. To be fair, this is our 50th one. We've done a year of them nearly, and we've only had technical issues once before, so we'll be okay with that. So welcome, and the good thing for me is now I don't know exactly what time I've started, so I won't know if I run over, so that's exciting. So yes, hello, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. This is the 50th in the series, and this is looking at the life and times of Marivor. So as I said, my name is Lorna Steele. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service, and as I have mentioned on several previous weeks, we have 4 archive centres across the Highlands. So we have the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, we have the Skye and Lochailsh Archive Centre in Portree, Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, and Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William. This week we're talking about a subject that's particularly relevant to Skye and Lochailsh, and I'll come on and talk about that and the importance of the life and times of Marivor to the Isle of Skye shortly. But before I go any further, a reminder, as you'll all be expecting, that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. So this month, as you'll be familiar if you've been kind of engaging with any of our 4 Facebook pages, you'll know that this month we're looking at the theme of stories and illustrations. Last week we looked at writers and authors in the collections, both professional and amateur, and thank you for joining me for that one and for all of your lovely comments on the back of that one, particularly in response to the work of the Milburn Academy school pupils. The school has been in contact with me to say that how grateful they were that those stories had been shared and that you had appreciated them and seen some of the work of their pupils. So that was really very much appreciated, both by the Highland Archive Service and also by Milburn Academy, so thank you for that. This week has also seen International Women's Day, and I'm sure, again, if you follow any of our Facebook pages, you'll have seen some of the posts about interesting women in our collections and also some of the images of the women who work in the service. So I wanted to, for this week's talk, to bring in both of those things, International Women's Day, stories and illustrations, but particularly to speak about one writer, and the reason for that also being that yesterday was the bicentenary of her birth. So we're looking today at the life and work of Marivor na Noran, Big Mary of the Songs. Oh, thank you, Pam, for saying it's always worth waiting for. I'm glad. So yes, we're looking at the work of Marivor na Noran, a nurse, a poet, a songwriter, a political activist, and a hugely important figure in Gaelic culture and in the culture of the Highlands. I'm going to talk a little bit about who Marivor was, why is she famous, why is she such an icon of Gaelic culture. But before I go much further into this, to say from the outset that I'm not a Gaelic speaker, so I am aware that however I reference her is slightly strange that it's not in the Gaelic language, so I'm aware of that. But also I think it's very important that she's a very well-known figure within Gaelic culture, but maybe not out with, so there's definitely something to be said for someone who doesn't have Gaelic as one of their languages to be able to take that story and share it outside that world as well. So who was Marivor? She was born on the 10th of March 1821, so as I say, her bicentenary yesterday. She was born in Skye in the Isle of Skye, and her parents were Flora McInnes and Ian or John MacDonald. She spent her childhood in the Isle of Skye. She spent time absorbing the culture, music, landscape, the values of the people of the island. She spent time in crofting work and working with home development of textiles, so things like spinning and things like that. And she was obviously from a young age an observer, and that's something we see a lot in archive collections, that the people who have the ability to watch, to observe what's happening around them, to take in experiences and store them up, can quite often become a powerful skill later in life. From a young age, she had an interest in poetry and music, and we think was writing from was composing poetry from a relatively young age, but it didn't really come to the fore until later on, as we will see. So those are her formative years spent in the Isle of Skye, surrounded and absorbing the culture and the values and the life of the island and the people of the island. In 1844, she moved to Inverness in a way that many people have often had to do, move away from their local area to get married, to find work, things like that. And so she moved to Inverness, where she married a man called Isaac Macpherson, who was a shoemaker in Inverness. And they went on to have 5 or 6 children. There's some kind of debate about how many children they had, but it seems as though 4 survived to adulthood. And from here on, she becomes known as Mairi Macpherson, or Mairi Macpherson, because obviously taking her husband's surname. Her husband died in 1871, and it's funny, I've sort of absolutely glossed over and flown through sort of 50 years of her life, and we'll see why in a second. But as is the case for so many people, that kind of cataclysmic event of losing a life partner forced a change in circumstances for her. And I find it really, really interesting and inspirational to note that it's really from this stage on that, of course, her story had started long before this, but it's at this stage on that she starts to produce the things that she becomes famous for. So really, it's not until she's over 50 that her story starts from a public point of view and her reputation was built. So as I said, the death of her husband in 1871 led to a change in circumstances, which meant that she needed to find work. So she had to go and, obviously her husband had been the breadwinner in the family. She then had to go out and find employment, and she found employment as a domestic servant and was working for the wife of an army officer in Inverness. And this was a turning point in her life. In 1872, Mairi was accused of stealing a piece of clothing that belonged to the army officer's wife. Now, it, by all accounts, seems very likely that this accusation was untrue. Stories suggested that the stolen piece of clothing had been hidden in her possessions by another servant who bore a grudge against her. We don't know what the truth of the situation is. What we do know is that for the whole of Marivor's life, she denied the accusation, she protested her innocence, and generally she was believed in that. When she was accused of stealing this piece of clothing, the case was taken to court, and her trial was aided by several very prominent and important people, including a well-known at the time a journalist, and the very well-known then and now politician and lawyer Charles Fraser Mackintosh. Now, as I say, he is still to this day very well known, a politician, a lawyer, an author, somebody very well respected, and it seems surprising that if the accusations were true, that people of that prominence would have fought her case with her. So anyways, as I say, the court papers don't survive as far as anybody is aware, but what we do know is that Marivor was found guilty of this theft, and as a result of that she was sentenced to 40 days imprisonment in Inverness Castle, where the prison was at the time. And if you watched when I did the talk on the spirit of the Highlands and the history of Inverness Castle, then there's a reference to that within there. So it's the castle itself has a very interesting story. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, please do look up that Learn with Lorna. I mentioned that this was a turning point. Now, this was an absolutely key moment in the life and story of Marivor, and really the thing that has made her what she is today. She spoke about her complete bemusement that anyone could think that she would bring so much shame on herself, on her family, on the people of Skye for the sake of a piece of clothing. She said she just couldn't understand why anyone would think she would do that. And it was this event, it was the shame of being arrested, the injustice of the fact that she protested so strongly that she was innocent of this theft, and the anger at the way she was treated that became the catalyst that brought her creativity to the fore. And she said throughout the remainder of her life that complete humiliation of being accused of something which she hadn't done and being taken to trial and being taken to prison was the thing that brought all her creativity out of her. It was her way of expressing her frustration, her disappointment, her injustice, her feeling of injustice at the way she had been treated. And as I said, I find that really inspirational, because really we don't know a huge amount of her life. Up until the age of 50, she had this childhood in Skye, where she was certainly had close relationships with her family, came to Inverness to be married, raised a family, but it wasn't until she hit the age of 50, her husband died and she was accused of this theft, that everything changed. And suddenly she went from being, this widowed lady to being suddenly a political activist, a campaigner, a poet, a writer. And at that time she wrote a polemic, so a long kind of verbal attack entitled, and I am well aware of the irony that I can't say this in Gaelic, entitled "I'm Tired of the English Speakers," about the fact that she felt that she had been treated very unfairly and unjustly, and that if she had been from a different part of society or a different part of the Scottish community, she wouldn't have been treated in the way she was. And as I say, that injustice and anger and frustration just burst out of her in a torrent of creativity. So she was held in prison for 40 days, and she was released in 1872. Now, you'll all be sick to the back teeth of hearing me talk about 1872, I'm entirely sure, but at least it's a different reason this week. Fascinating year. Of course, the Accusation Act, the release of Marivor from prison, which then led to this burst of creativity. It's also, just as an aside, the year that we first got a secret ballot in this country. So I find it never ceasingly interesting to think of all the things that are happening at the same time. And this was a huge year for developments in Scotland in all sorts of ways. So 1872, she was released from prison. We don't know why. She moved to Glasgow this year. I don't know, but I wonder if there's an element of that complete humiliation of the way she felt leading to her leaving the community that she had been a part of, because she talked so much about the feeling of shame. Maybe that was a factor in her leaving the Highlands. But she moved to Glasgow, age 50, 51-ish, and she trained as a nurse and a midwife, and she got her nursing certificate and her obstetrics diploma from the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. She also used this time to learn to read and write in English. And again, I find it kind of fabulous, really, that you would get to 50 and then go, right, what am I doing? And have this huge change. So she lived in Glasgow and then later in Greenock until 1882. So a 10-year life of working in Glasgow. So it's interesting to think that there will be people out there, you know, not many generations back, who would have been delivered by Marivor. I'll carry on in a second by talking about that what happened in Glasgow and what the next part of her life was. But before I go any further, to remind you that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then that would be very much appreciated. So I mentioned that she spent this 10-year period in Glasgow. So there's all these influences. There's the childhood in Skye, there's the life in Inverness, that cataclysmic moment of being arrested, and then this life in Glasgow. And all of these things came together to contribute to what Marivor became. So this time that she was working in Skye, she began to interact a lot with others who were kind of expat, if you like, members of the Skye community and the island communities who had moved away for work or other purposes. So she became, she kind of socialised with those groups of people in the west side of Scotland. She attended concerts and ceilidhs, and by this point was becoming very well known for the poems and the songs that she was creating. And so this is when she really starts to become known as Marivor na Noran, which translates as Great Mary of the Songs or Big Mary of the Songs. She referred to herself with a slightly more flattering term, but we'll come back to that. So as well as moving among these Highland communities in terms of socialising and becoming known, she also became heavily involved at this point with the leading advocates of Highland land reform at the time. So the context of this is that the clearances had been happening for many years by this point, and this is, again, if you're something you're interested in, then please do have a look at the clearances Learn with Lorna that we did way back at the beginning a year ago. So these were landlords dispersing tenants, either forcibly or not, and either overseas or onto other lesser parts of land, and that was to make way for sheep farms, for deer farms, and other purposes. So that's the context that Marivor had kind of grown up around. The clearances, famines. One of the big serious issues was the lack of security of tenure for tenants. So if you were a tenant who had a landlord, then there was no guarantee. And again, this is something we're seeing a lot in the news at the moment because of COVID, how things can very quickly become very precarious if you have no security of tenure, if there's nothing stopping somebody from evicting you. So Mary had grown up seeing people in very precarious and vulnerable situations. People who were either cleared off their land or at risk of being moved off their land. But this was all happening at the same time as a huge change in increasing democracy. So this was a time where people were beginning to have a bit more of a voice. And as I mentioned, 1872, the Secret Ballot Act. So at this stage, people are starting to have a bit more voice, a bit more of a chance to make themselves heard. And what was happening by this period was people who were holding land raids or holding rent strikes against those landlords who were threatening to evict them or were evicting them. So there was a huge campaign for land reform and reform of the systems governing land management, all happening at this time. So it's a sort of perfect storm of things happening at the same time. And so Marivor was finding herself in Glasgow, moving among people who had moved from the islands to find work, but also moving amongst those who were strongly and heavily involved in campaigning for land management reform. And these were, of course, causes that were very close to her heart. And again, things that fired up those passions in her about inequality, injustice, the treatment of the Gaels, the fact that certain people were treated differently from other people. And again, it's so much about injustice and inequality, which is one of the reasons she inspires people so much. And these themes found their way into songs and into poetry, and that was her way of expressing those things. And she gained a reputation for her passionate support of the Crofters and of the Land Reform Act. And again, if you're particularly interested in this and how this whole thing kind of played out, then please do go and have a look at the Learn with Lorna that I did on Crofters and the Napier Commission, because this is all happening at the same time. The evidence that was gathered and the commission that kind of looked at how to reform land management. So, time spent in Skye, time spent in Inverness, time spent in prison, time spent in Glasgow and Greenock, and then in 1882, Mairi Mhor returned to Skye. Now, if you did watch that Learn with Lorna about the Napier Commission, you will know that 1882 was a very important year in the story of the Isle of Skye. It's interesting to note that when Mairi went back, how much her attitudes had changed. So there's a poem that she composed on leaving Skye for Glasgow, where she speaks about the beautiful hills, the mist coming down, looking across the water, and the impact that the island had on her heart and on her emotions. When she went back to Skye after leaving Glasgow, she speaks about the fact that this landscape now, even though it's the homeland given to them by God, they are no longer allowed to walk on it where they want to. They're no longer allowed to go the places that they choose to go because someone else is controlling that. It had been my intention, if my technology had not let me down this morning, to read both of those poems to you, but what I'll do instead is when I finish speaking, I'll put them into the comments of this video so that you can have a wee look at those two poems. So as I said, if you have watched the Learn with Lorna on the Napier Commission, or just if you know about this subject generally, you'll know that 1882 was a key year, and the fact that she went back that year to Skye is very interesting. This was the year of the Battle of the Braes. So this is when the Crofters of Braes, which is near Portree, had been told that they could no longer graze their animals on the land that they had grazed their animals on for countless generations. They'd been told by the landlord that they weren't able to graze their animals there any longer, and so they had refused to pay their rent to their landlord until this was changed. And their landlord, Lord MacDonald, served eviction notices to get rid of the Crofters and get them off the land. When the sheriff officers arrived with these eviction notices, the tenants burnt them, and dozens of police were brought in from Glasgow to enforce the eviction notices, which resulted in combat between the police and the Crofters, and the arrest and fining of several of those Crofters, again at Inverness Castle, where the court and the prison was at the time. At the time of the Battle of the Braes, the sympathy and the publicity was very largely on the Crofters' side, and what happened was this event led to a wider audience the plight of the Crofters, the inequalities, the injustices, the fact that at any given moment they could be evicted off their land. And so this very largely at the time sympathy of all sorts of people came out on side of the Crofters. And this was one of the things that led to the Napier Commission and that Royal Commission into land management. Now, Marivor was a very big part of that publicity, and the fact that there was such a public outcry about it. She wrote various poems and songs around about this time, but one particular one which quite often captures people's hearts and emotions and rouses emotions is a poem in which she described the noble heroes who had fought in that battle, that these were noble men who had handcuffs forced on them, and that these were kind and well-mannered women who had their skulls broken while trying to defend their own houses. Powerful and emotive writing. Now, I mentioned earlier that Charles Fraser Mackintosh, who had supported Marivor during her trial for theft, I mentioned him earlier. Now, she supported him as he campaigned for election as an MP. Her skill at conveying a message through oral medium became very, very useful at this time, because this is a Gaelic-speaking audience at a time of English journalism. And so songs and poetry and oral tradition was very much used to get a message across. And so that was really a powerful tool at the time. Now, I noted right at the beginning that I wouldn't be able to read you any of her poetry in Gaelic because I don't speak it. But it's interesting to note, as I talk there about her skill in oral communication, was that she also couldn't write in Gaelic. So she could, if somebody wrote her works down, she was able to kind of read them and understand what they said. But she herself couldn't write down her own poetry and words and songs in her native tongue. She could only write in English because she had learned how to speak English while she was in Gaelic. And I just find that very interesting from many different points of view, but particularly because that's why her ability in oral communication was so important, because it was at this time, to a fair extent, still an oral tradition. So we have her poetry because she was able to recite it to others and they wrote it down for her. And this resulted in the publication of Gaelic Songs and Poems by Mrs. Mairi Mhor, it was called. And that in turn resulted in her invitation to become the official bard for the Clan MacDonald Society. So I don't know quite what order that happened in, but that awareness that people had of her ability to communicate and her power at getting these messages across was seen and used both by politicians but also by the clan societies and others. Now, I mentioned that I've been referring to her throughout as Marivor or Marivor na Noran, which is how she tends to be known. As I say, the poetry was published under Mrs. Mairi Mhor. Marivor na Noran meaning Great Mary or Big Mary of the songs, although she herself often referred to herself as Mari Nihian Ban, which means Mary, daughter of fair-haired John. But the reason I wanted to touch on that quickly was just to tell you a quick story, which is that, as I mentioned, her name translates as Great Mary or Big Mary of the songs. Now, big can have several meanings, so there's a feeling that there is, of course, that she is a great person in iconic stature, so she has a great role to play, but also great in physical stature. And if any of you are familiar, and you will have seen a picture of her as part of this advert for this event, she looks sort of like a Scottish Queen Victoria. And in one of her songs, she describes an experience where at 17 stone, she says she was supposed to be joining Charles Fraser Mackintosh and some others in a rowing boat at Strome Ferry, but the ferried man, the man rowing the boat, said that if she was to get in, the boat would probably sink and probably none of them would make it. And therefore it was best if he took all the men and then came back to row her on her own to make sure everyone survived. And the reason I tell that story is just from several things that I've read, she comes across as a convivial and fun-loving woman. And I think she told that story, with a smile on her face. So she becomes this huge iconic figure in Gaelic culture. She sang at the first National Mod, which, for those of you who are not familiar, is a moving, peripatetic festival that travels around Scotland, celebrating traditional culture and hosting events and awards and celebrations of poetry and music and all sorts of things to do with Scottish culture. And she sang at the first National Mod. She didn't win anything, but she sang at it. Marivor died eventually 7th of November 1898. And she died in Portree, and she's buried in the Chapel Yard Cemetery in Inverness alongside her husband Isaac. And it's an interesting cemetery. We've spoken about that before, and it might be an interesting thing to do a talk on the cemetery itself, just because it's a particularly important cemetery in the story of the Highlands. But her legacy lives on, and I'm seeing comments coming in about that, about people writing about her, people studying. Her poetry and song is still celebrated and appreciated. There are Marivor choirs, there's all sorts of other references to her in our culture. And in 2018, Atlas Arts, in collaboration with Portree Library and Skye and Irish Archive Centre, ran a project which aimed to try and address the gender imbalance on Wikipedia. They had discovered that of all the biographies on Wikipedia, there was a huge gender imbalance, and there were hardly any biographies of women on there, and that there weren't very many at all to do with the women of Skye or people in Skye in general. And so this project between Atlas Arts, Skye and Irish Archive Centre and Portree Library aimed to correct that, and they selected several women from the history of Skye, including Marivor, and they researched about these women's lives and created profiles for them on Wikipedia. A really interesting and important project, and one that it was great for our Skye and Irish team to be involved with. So do have a look at that project. The project was called Women of Skye, and you can find out about all the women that they chose to focus on and research. If you're interested in finding out more about Marivor or more about her poetry or her songs, then if you have a look on Ambala, our website, www.ambala.org.uk, AMBAILE, then there's poems on there, there's readings, there's songs in Gaelic and in English, so please do have a look at that. Her life was important because she campaigned against injustice, always important. She highlighted a plight of a group of people. She brought that to public attention through the medium of creativity, which I like. It's great to see an important and prolific, prominent woman as well to be able to talk about. She raised important issues and highlighted them around land, community and justice, and those are things that continue to resonate today, both in the Highlands and in with a wider audience. So I appreciate her work from a creative point of view. I appreciate it from the point of view of the purpose that it served. I appreciate somebody campaigning for against any kind of injustice or inequality. But I also find it really encouraging to think that she probably got to 50 without thinking that this would be the time that she would come into herself and into public awareness. And I think it's just an encouraging thing, and you'll know if you've watched any of these that I like to find these things. I think it's important to note that you never know what will be the thing that forms your legacy. So it may be something hard, it may be something traumatic, it may be something that you wish had never ever happened to you, like being arrested for something. It might not happen until you think it's too late for you to make a difference, and it might not be the thing that you would choose to make a difference. But you can take inspiration from this story, as I say, aside from all of those other things I've referred to there, that you never know what will be the thing that will determine your legacy and how you're seen by subsequent generations. And that's a great inspirational, positive thing to think about, I think. So I'm going to stop talking. Once again, I'm truly sorry that I started so late, and and if I have sounded flustered at all, I tried dozens of attempts to make this to go live as quickly as I could. So I hope you've enjoyed hearing a little bit about Marivor, who should be more well known out with the Gaelic community than she is, I think. So hopefully we've done a little bit to address that today. So thank you for joining me. I hope you can join me again next week. I'll be looking at a collection from Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives, which is the work of David Barrigill Keith. I have everything I own crossed that everything will work perfectly smoothly next week. I'm just seeing your question. Yes, if you want to come back and watch the earlier ones, they are all available on Facebook. They're all available on YouTube as well, on the High Life Highland YouTube channel. So please do go back and have a look and let me know how you get on with them. Your comments are always so much appreciated, so thank you so much for that. We will be coming to the year of doing Learn with Lorna in a couple of weeks. I mentioned previously that I would like to put out a survey, so I will be doing that, and if anyone is able to respond to the survey about how you felt about this series, how you've engaged with it, whether you've enjoyed it, then I would really appreciate that. So before I go, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we would very much appreciate that. And I am going now to have a cup of tea, so I hope you all do the same. Thank you.